box was placed on my lap at exactly 7:42 p.m. It was wrapped, sealed, and heavier than it looked. Everyone watched. I did not open it. I asked who prepared it. No one answered. I noticed the return address was a law firm, not a store. My son said it was just paperwork. I felt the weight again. I am Janet. I am 60 years old. I have lived long enough to know when a gift is not a gift. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heart-warming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard, and drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. Christmas night had been arranged carefully. The tree lights were warm. The table was full. The smiles were practiced. I had arrived with nothing in my hands because I was told to come empty. That should have warned me. When the box was finally pushed toward me, I noticed my daughter avoided my eyes. My grandson stopped recording on his phone. Someone locked the front door. Inside the box was a sealed envelope, stamped and notarized, instructing me not to open it without legal counsel present. No card, no explanation, just a signature I recognized. My husband's. He had been gone for 3 years. I asked when this was prepared. My son said it was for my protection. I asked why it was given on Christmas. He said timing mattered. The room went quiet. I felt something shift, not emotionally, but structurally, like a floor giving way beneath furniture. This was not about love. This was about control. I placed the box back on the table. I said nothing. I understood then that whatever was inside had already been discussed without me. The holiday was a cover. The gift was a trigger. And by morning, nothing in my family would be arranged the way it had been the night before. The morning after Christmas did not soften anything. It sharpened it. I woke before daylight, the house still, the kind of quiet that exposes every thought. I sat at the kitchen table where wrapping paper still waited in a neat pile, untouched, as if it were evidence rather than trash. I did not open the box again. I did not need to. What I needed was context, and context arrived in fragments as the day moved. Phone calls went unanswered. Texts were read and ignored. By noon, I understood the pattern. Silence was not avoidance. It was coordination. I reviewed the card once more, the handwriting deliberate, the message neutral, the absence of warmth unmistakable. This was not a mistake. This was prepared. I remembered the months before, how conversations shifted, how financial questions arrived disguised as concern, how holiday plans were finalized without my input, how documents were suddenly mentioned, and then withdrawn. I stood and walked the house, room to room, noting what was missing, what had quietly changed. A file drawer locked that had never been locked before. A spare key no longer on its hook. I checked my calendar and realized an appointment had been canceled without my knowledge. I did not panic. I took notes. I wrote times, names, small inconsistencies. By afternoon, I placed the box back on the table and slid it away from the light, as if that alone could keep it from rewriting my place in the family. Outside, neighbors carried leftovers to cars and waved goodbye. Inside, I called a law office recommended years ago and asked a careful question without explaining why. The receptionist paused before answering. That pause told me more than words could. I was not the first. I was not early either. Whatever had been done had already been filed, timed to a holiday when offices close and people hesitate. I sat down again, steady, and accepted the truth forming in front of me. Christmas had been used to mask a legal move, and I was expected to receive it quietly. I folded the card, placed it back in the box, and realized the next step would not be emotional or loud. It would be procedural, slow, and irreversible if I waited another day. The call came before dawn, short and procedural, informing me that the documents had been reviewed, and that what I had received was not a gift, not even legally speaking, but a conditional transfer wrapped in seasonal language and buried obligations. And as I sat at my kitchen table with the receiver still warm in my hand, the house silent except for the ticking clock, I replayed Christmas night in my mind with new clarity. The way my son avoided eye contact, the way my daughter-in-law positioned the box closer to me than to anyone else, the way the room went quiet after I opened it, not celebratory quiet, but watchful, as if they were waiting for something to click into place. Now it had, because the lawyer explained that accepting what was inside that box meant assuming responsibility for a debt I had never signed for, a property dispute already in litigation, and a clause that transferred liability the moment I acknowledged receipt, which I had done with a polite smile and a thank you under the tree. And I realized then that the holiday had not been the stage for generosity, but for timing chosen carefully, because people lower their guard at Christmas, because no one expects a legal trap wrapped in red paper. And as the sun began to rise through the blinds, illuminating the stack of papers I had laid out across the table, I felt no shock, only a steady narrowing of focus, because this was not carelessness on their part, but design. A plan that required me to be sentimental, predictable, and silent, and I understood that the story they were telling themselves was that I would absorb this quietly the way I always had. But the lawyer's final sentence stayed with me long after the call ended, that I still had a narrow window to respond, and that what I chose next would determine whether this ended as a misunderstanding or escalated into something none of them could undo. And as I folded the papers back into their envelope with deliberate care, I knew the next conversation would not happen under a tree or over dinner, but across a desk where intentions are no longer disguised as tradition. The letter arrived without a return address, thick paper, legal weight, and a warning printed in plain ink that said the contents were not intended for casual reading. And the moment I held it, I knew Christmas had ended for me. I am Janet, and by the time this envelope crossed my threshold, my family had already made their decision. I just hadn't been informed yet. The seal was unbroken, but the message was clear. This was not a gift. It was a mechanism. I did not open it immediately. I placed it on the kitchen counter, beside a cooling cup of coffee, and watched the clock move forward while my mind moved backward, replaying every holiday smile, every careful silence, every moment I had mistaken politeness for loyalty. When I finally slid the letter free, it was not warmth that met me, but structure, clauses, references, timelines, obligations. A trust amendment, executed weeks earlier, dated deliberately, signed by hands I recognized. My name appeared often, but never in the way a mother expects to see it. I was listed as a condition, a variable, something to be managed. The language was clean, professional, and final, outlining how assets would be redistributed after my death, and more disturbingly, how my access to certain accounts would be supervised while I was still alive, all under the justification of protection and efficiency. There was no accusation, no insult, just quiet authority replacing my own. I read every line standing up because sitting felt like surrender, and with each paragraph, the room seemed to rearrange itself, furniture no longer familiar, walls no longer mine. They had not taken my name from the family. They had done something far more precise. They had reduced me to a legal risk. At the bottom of the letter was a final sentence, colder than the rest, advising that independent legal counsel was recommended before responding. That was the moment clarity arrived, not emotional, not dramatic, structural. This was not about misunderstanding or hurt feelings. This was planning, strategic, calculated, and the people who taught me the meaning of family had decided it was safer to plan around me than with me. I folded the letter carefully, returned it to the envelope, and understood something without needing confirmation. Whatever Christmas they thought they had given me, it was not meant to be opened alone, and it was never meant to be refused. The instant I stepped into the car, I felt the emptiness of the night press against my skin, the leather seat cold and unyielding beneath me. The city was silent, yet each passing street lamp cast fleeting shadows that danced across my face like a warning I couldn't ignore. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles whitened, aware that every light reflected not just off the glass, but into the cracks of my life I had tried to ignore. My phone buzzed a text from my son, curt, indifferent, completely unaware that the envelope I had received earlier could unravel everything he thought he owned. I drove past houses festooned with Christmas lights, each twinkling bulb mocking the warmth I had been denied. And I thought of the lawyer's voice earlier that day, calm but edged with gravity. You need to see this for yourself. No one can interfere. No one can stop it. The thought churned in my chest like bitter smoke. Each red light forced me to pause, to stare at my reflection in the darkened glass, the face looking back older, more careful, carved with a patience I hadn't known I possessed. I remembered the holiday dinners where laughter had been a pretense, where whispered calculations replaced conversations, where my presence was tolerated but never welcomed. And now, the legal documents I clutched tightly in my bag were not just papers, they were a reckoning. A quiet, cold reckoning no Christmas cheer could soften. I imagined my son opening the letter, the legal language stripping him bare, revealing greed he never thought I could expose. I thought of the subtle shifts, the veiled insults, the dismissive gestures, the way my contributions had been measured as if they were debts owed rather than love freely given. Driving through the dark streets, my hands steady despite the storm in my chest, I realized that tonight, under the veil of twinkling lights, the truth would be laid bare, unflinching, merciless, and I would be the one holding the scales. Nothing would ever feel safe again. Not the house, not the dinners, not the smiles. The law would speak louder than any holiday song, and the silence that followed would be deafening. The moment I opened the door to the kitchen, the silence hit me like a physical weight. The faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound daring to disturb the darkness. And I could almost feel the emptiness of the house pressing in, waiting, patient and unyielding. On the counter lay the envelope, its edges sharp, its presence heavy, as if it carried every insult, every dismissal, every calculated disregard from the family I had nurtured and protected for decades. I hesitated, my fingers hovering just above it, aware that pulling it closer would set in motion consequences I could not undo. That every detail within its folds was a reckoning in waiting, legal language sharp enough to cut through pretenses and expose motives that had remained hidden beneath polite words and holiday smiles. My reflection in the window behind me mirrored a woman older than her years, shoulders squared against a storm of betrayal. Eyes steady, though the pulse of tension beat fast beneath my calm exterior. I thought of my son's earlier messages, so flippant, so dismissive, as if my presence in the family's affairs were optional, as if my years of sacrifices were negligible, invisible, erased by convenience and ego. The memory of laughter that had been hollow, conversations that had been careful performances, and holidays that had masked greed and selfishness surged through me, coiling like a dark vine, ready to strike. I touched the envelope finally, the paper stiff beneath my fingers, and felt the cold inevitability of truth pressing in. Signatures, clauses, legal bindings, each a calculated instrument of revelation, each capable of shattering the fragile illusion of control they believed they had. Outside, snow began to fall lightly, silent and indifferent, the lights from neighboring homes twinkling like distant, unreachable warmth, a reminder that joy had always been measured, rationed, and for me, always out of reach. And in that stark, unyielding kitchen, I realized that tonight, the holiday facade would crumble, and the quiet that followed would echo the weight of every deceit, every slight, and every choice they thought they could hide. I was ready to witness it unfold, to watch the truth reach the ones who had underestimated me, and to finally feel the weight of justice in my own hands. The second I stepped into the courthouse, the weight of judgment pressed against my shoulders like a cold, unyielding stone, and I felt every eye in the room glance over, assessing, questioning, not yet knowing the storm they were about to witness. I moved slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the hollow halls where decisions were made, lives weighed, and pretenses stripped bare. My heels clicking against the marble floor like a metronome, counting down consequences. No one could escape. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and ink, sterile and neutral, yet heavy with the anticipation of revelations. And as I approached the gallery seats, I could see my son's posture tighten, subtle but telling, his confidence unaware of the inevitability looming over him. Legal papers sat neatly stacked on the clerk's desk, their weight physical, binding, each signature, and clause a mirror reflecting the years of calculated ignorance, entitlement, and disrespect I had endured silently. My hands rested calmly in my lap as I waited, eyes scanning the rows of empty and occupied seats, the polished benches, a stark contrast to the turmoil twisting quietly in my chest. A silent storm contained beneath measured composure. Memories collided with the present, the dismissive gestures at family gatherings, the quiet manipulations behind closed doors, the casual disregard for my presence and contributions, each one a thread in a web I was now ready to unravel with precise, measured force. The judge entered, robes sweeping the floor, neutral expression concealing the weight of authority. And for the first time, I felt the true gravity of the law as an instrument of clarity, cold and merciless, yet just. I understood in that instant that no more pretense could survive the meticulous reading of documents. No more false smiles would hold against the clarity of evidence. The room, sterile and silent, felt alive with consequences poised to descend. Each breath of mine a calm before a reckoning. And I realized that tonight, in this court, the balance would shift irrevocably, exposing greed, ignorance, and entitlement, and finally giving the truth a voice too potent to ignore. While the shadows of the courthouse walls bore witness to the inevitable unraveling of everything they had taken for granted. The instant I saw my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I froze, not from shock, but from the weight of realization that every line etched on my face told a story no one had acknowledged. A ledger of sacrifices recorded silently in the hollows beneath my eyes, and the tension in my jaw. The early morning light sliced through the blinds, harsh and impartial, illuminating the stark reality of the room, the cold tiles, the empty sink, the quiet that had never truly welcomed warmth. And I traced the curve of my hands, as if reading the margin notes of a life meticulously ignored. My son's messages from last night lingered in my mind like a sharp residue, their brevity a knife cutting through the soft fabric of assumed familial respect. A reminder that every gesture I had offered, every dollar, every hour, every unspoken compromise had been cataloged as insufficient. The envelope rested on the edge of the counter, its weight heavier than any ornamented gift, promising truths that no holiday cheer could soften, secrets that demanded exposure, and consequences that would strike harder than words ever could. I turned the tap, letting water run briefly, the drip punctuating the silence, each droplet a metronome marking the moments before the inevitable confrontation. I imagined the scene later, my son, confronted with signatures and clauses, forced to reckon with the legal instruments that rendered all his assumptions invalid, stripped of convenience, of pretense, of entitlement, while I watched silently, poised and unyielding, the calm before the storm. The mirror reflected not just my face, but the architecture of endurance, of patience honed into a weapon. And I recognized that the holiday had become a theater for truths long suppressed. And I, finally aware of my own power, was no longer a passive observer, but the orchestrator of the revelation. The quiet storm ready to reshape the family I had carried for decades. A reckoning hidden beneath polite smiles and empty traditions, waiting only for the precise moment to strike, measured, deliberate, unflinching. The moment I stepped onto the porch, the cold December air struck me with the clarity of every truth I had been avoiding. The quiet of the street, swallowing the faint crunch of snow beneath my boots, as though the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. The house before me, so familiar and yet alien under the muted glow of the porch lights, carried the weight of decades of smiles forced, laughter measured, and gestures carefully calculated to conceal greed and entitlement. My hands clutched the envelope tighter, its presence now almost alive, each crease and fold a silent warning, a countdown to exposure. And I could feel the years of neglect and dismissal pressing against my ribs, urging me forward while whispering the inevitability of reckoning. Every lighted window seemed like a witness, a jury of silent observers, unknowing of the legal weight hidden within my grasp. And I imagined the conversations inside, polite on the surface, hollow at the core, oblivious to the storm approaching. my son's earlier arrogance, the dismissive glances, the subtle acts of entitlement, played behind my eyes like a rehearsal for humiliation. Yet I felt no rush, no need for dramatics, only the precision of inevitability. I moved across the porch deliberately, boots clicking against the weathered wood, the cold seeping through the soles, but failing to penetrate the armor of patience and control I had forged over years of disregard. I thought of the documents inside that envelope, signatures and clauses that would strip away assumptions, privileges, and illusions. And for the first time in decades, I felt the balance of power shift subtly in my favor. Faint sound of a neighbor's distant laughter, the hum of holiday lights, and the soft patter of snow combined with the oppressive quiet of my own anticipation. And in that stillness, I realized that tonight, the facade of civility would collapse, that pretense would be exposed, and that the house that had held secrecy, entitlement, and false pride for years would finally bear witness to truths long ignored. Every breath I drew was measured, every step purposeful, and the night itself seemed to bow in acknowledgement of the reckoning I carried, silent, inevitable, and unstoppable. The instant I entered the living room, the faint hum of the Christmas tree lights felt almost accusatory, a quiet reminder of years spent performing joy, while silence had always lingered between us, heavy and unyielding. Shadows stretched across the floor, elongating the emptiness in ways that made the space feel both familiar and foreign. And I immediately noticed the subtle tension in the room, the almost imperceptible movements of figures blurred in the background, frozen in the midst of hushed arguments, their faces obscured, yet their postures screaming indifference and entitlement. I carried the envelope in my hand, its edges biting through my fingers like the truth it held would bite through the very fabric of our family's pretense. And I realized the power in my grasp had always been underestimated, quietly accumulating, while they assumed ignorance or weakness. Every breath I drew was deliberate, controlled, as if the room itself were a stage, and my presence the signal for the performance of reckoning to begin. And I allowed myself a moment to observe the nuances, the sideways glances, the small shifts of unease, the sudden stillness that appeared to hover in the corners, as though instinctively aware of the storm I carried. Memories surged silently behind my eyes, the dismissive tones, the calculated silences at dinners, the polite gestures that masked disregard and entitlement. And now, each one was a thread in the tapestry of evidence I held, waiting for its moment to unravel the comfortable illusions they had constructed. I placed the envelope gently on the table, its presence enough to draw the eye without a word, and I watched as the subtle weight of curiosity, fear, and disbelief began to replace arrogance, the room itself adjusting to the gravity of impending truths. The holiday decor glinted softly under the dim lights, a fragile mask over a foundation long cracked by negligence. And I realized that this night, the quiet unraveling of appearances, the exposure of hidden agendas, and the revelation of true motives would be as cold, inevitable, and precise as the law that guided every line within the envelope. And in that silence, I felt the finality of preparation, the meticulous patience of decades paying off, the controlled unfolding of reckoning, all while the shadows in the room lengthened and the air thickened with truths too long denied, waiting for no one's approval, bending even the faintest pretense to its inevitable conclusion. The moment I sat at the desk. The weight of the envelope before me felt almost tangible, pressing down with the gravity of decisions long deferred, of truths carefully ignored, of years of subtle betrayals that had been catalogued in silence. I placed my hands deliberately over the papers, fingertips grazing the edges of contracts and clauses that had been drafted with cold precision. And for the first time, I allowed myself to fully imagine the repercussions, the calculations my son and others had made, the arrogance that assumed my absence of agency, the presumption that my voice would remain unheard. My eyes scanned the lines, signatures etched in ink that would unravel assumptions, each paragraph a measured instrument of exposure, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes from knowing control is finally in one's hands. Round me, the room was quiet, the soft ticking of a clock, a metronome, counting down the moments before the inevitable revelation. And I noticed the subtle details, the shadows cast by the desk lamp, the faint smell of aged paper, the sterile air that amplified the gravity of legal truth. I thought of the family gatherings where laughter had been hollow, where conversations were performances, and where my contributions had been treated as obligations rather than acts of care. Each memory sharpened the focus in my mind, reinforcing the necessity of precision and patience. When I lifted the pen, the weight of the moment pressed fully upon my shoulders, yet my hands were steady, guided by years of observation and the meticulous accumulation of knowledge that no one had respected. I imagined the eventual faces, the shock, the disbelief, the sudden realization that entitlement was no longer protection, that manipulation would not survive scrutiny, that every assumption of power I had been denied would be overturned by the authority of law and evidence. And in that measured silence, I understood that the holiday season, the facade of warmth, and the polite pretenses would crumble, leaving only the unflinching clarity of truth. And I, poised and deliberate, would witness its quiet but unstoppable descent, each moment calibrated to reveal everything they thought they had hidden, every omission, every slight, every lie laid bare in cold, clinical light. The instant I stepped to the window, the city lights spread beneath me like a grid of lives, unaware of the reckoning hovering just above their rooftops. Each flicker indifferent to the storm I had been orchestrating quietly, patiently. For decades, I traced the horizon with a steady gaze, the neon glows and distant traffic blending into a blur, as if the world itself were a reflection of assumptions waiting to be shattered. My hands rested lightly on the windowsill, yet beneath the calm, a calculated tension coiled, every muscle poised for the inevitable confrontation, every thought aligned with the precision of legal certainty. I thought of the countless holiday dinners, of whispered exclusions and polite dismissals, of the subtle ways entitlement had masked greed and betrayal. Each memory now a tool I wielded with quiet authority. The envelope sat on the table behind me, the documents inside heavier than their physical weight suggested, carrying signatures, clauses, and obligations that would strip away every illusion of control my son and others believed they held. Outside, the cold wind rattled the window slightly, indifferent, echoing the inevitability that awaited inside the house, the inevitability of exposure, of consequences, of truth articulated with surgical precision, leaving no room for excuses or charm. I imagined the expressions when the contents were finally revealed, shock, disbelief, anger, barely contained. The realization that no amount of arrogance could withstand the impartiality of law. I did not need to raise my voice, to demand attention, or to justify my presence. The weight of what I held, the patient culmination of every slight and every unacknowledged effort, spoke louder than any argument ever could. The city lights, the cold wind, the quiet of the early evening, all conspired to underscore the stark reality. The holiday facade was irrelevant. The past pretenses meaningless. And I, standing in calm observation, carried the power to rewrite the terms, to reveal every carefully hidden truth, and to watch the inevitable collapse of every pretense unfold with measured, deliberate inevitability, leaving only clarity, exposure, and resolution in its wake. The instant I stepped into the empty room, the air felt thicker than usual, as if the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable unraveling that I now carried in silence. Boxes stacked neatly along the walls, furniture arranged with clinical precision, and the faint smell of cold wood and dust pressed in on me. A stark reminder that appearances had always mattered more than truth in this family. I moved slowly across the floor, heels clicking softly against polished hardwood, each step a measured assertion that I was no longer a passive observer in a play scripted by entitlement and deception. The envelope in my bag weighed heavier with each passing second, its contents promising clarity and exposure. A quiet storm ready to dismantle years of assumed power and hidden greed. I paused by the window, the fading daylight casting long, skeletal shadows across the room, and I thought of every subtle dismissal, every whispered insult, every time my presence had been minimized or ignored, as though my contributions had been irrelevant. Yet now, the precision of the law, the meticulous documentation of facts, and the patient accumulation of knowledge transformed those years of neglect into tools, instruments I could wield without fury, without theatrics, only the measured inevitability of consequence. I imagined the moment the documents were revealed, the careful reading, the shock crystallizing on the faces of those who had underestimated me, the realization that every assumption, every act of entitlement, every dismissal would be rendered powerless under the clarity of undeniable truth. The silence of the room was oppressive, yet controlled. The only movement, the subtle shift of light as the sun dipped lower, painting the walls in muted, somber tones, and I felt the calm before the storm. A quiet authority that had been cultivated through decades of oversight, patience, and unacknowledged labor. In that room, I understood that the facade of civility, the pretense of harmony, and the carefully constructed masks of privilege would all crumble, leaving only the unflinching exposure of truth, precise, impartial, and mercilessly inevitable, with me standing at the center, both witness and executor of the reckoning that had been waiting years to unfold. The moment I settled into the waiting area, the sterile air pressed against my skin like the weight of unspoken truths, and I could feel every second stretching, deliberate and unrelenting, as if time itself were complicit in the reckoning I carried. Chairs lined the walls, empty and obedient, while the faint hum of a distant heater punctuated the oppressive quiet. Each breath I drew measured, precise, conscious of the subtle shifts in my surroundings. My hands rested calmly on my knees, envelope concealed beneath them, its contents heavier than any physical object, promising exposure and consequences long overdue, while the polished floors reflected light in muted streaks that seemed to emphasize the isolation I had chosen to confront. I thought of the family gatherings where my presence had been tolerated but never acknowledged, the polite conversations that had masked greed and entitlement, the quiet dismissals that had accumulated into decades of unspoken resentment and hidden observation. Round me, the walls were neutral, sterile, intentionally unremarkable. Yet within that simplicity, the tension thickened, carrying the inevitability of confrontation, the unflinching clarity of what would follow. Once the documents were revealed, I imagined the expressions, the subtle tightening of jaws, the sudden stillness that would betray shock and disbelief. And I felt no rush, no need to provoke theatrically. The law, the meticulous compilation of truth, and the patient accumulation of evidence were instruments of their own precision. Silent but unyielding, each tick of the clock echoed like a metronome, measuring the moments until exposure, until pretense crumbled, until entitlement faced the impartiality of evidence, while the muted lighting and quiet atmosphere amplified every heartbeat, every breath, every shadow that shifted across the room. I understood, in that exact moment, that the holiday cheer outside these walls, the faint glow of distant decorations, meant nothing to the gravity within. Civility was fragile, and the revelation I carried would dismantle it systematically, leaving only the undeniable, precise, and cold clarity of truth, with me poised as witness, executor, and final arbiter of consequences they had never imagined. The moment I sat in the quiet corner of the room, my eyes fixed on the phone lying face down on the table, the weight of everything I had endured settled over me like an invisible shroud, pressing me into stillness, yet sharpening every sense. The air was dense, heavy with the anticipation of what would come, each tick of a distant clock echoing through the sterile environment, marking the passage of time with deliberate precision, counting down to exposure. I recalled the countless holiday gatherings, the subtle dismissals, the veiled insults, and the carefully curated smiles that had never reached genuine warmth. Each memory, a cold reminder of the invisible ledger of grudges and greed I had silently observed. The envelope rested near my hands, a compact package of reckoning, its weight almost tangible, promising a shift in balance that would be sudden and unavoidable. And I felt the inevitability coil through my chest, steadying me as it sharpened my focus. Every detail of the room became part of the narrative. The muted light from a single overhead fixture, the polished surfaces reflecting faint shadows, the careful order of chairs and tables that contrasted the chaos that had been concealed for years within family interactions. I imagined the moment the contents were finally acknowledged, the shock crystallizing on the faces of those who had underestimated me, the subtle tremor of disbelief, and the sudden recalibration of assumed power. And I knew that my calm, deliberate posture would amplify the precision of impact. Outside, faint sounds of traffic and distant holiday lights whispered of a world oblivious to the quiet storm within these walls. Yet the contrast only heightened the inevitability of what I carried, a truth that required no drama, no embellishment, only measured revelation. I felt the weight of decades, the sacrifices unrecognized, the contributions minimized, the patience tested, converge in this single moment. each heartbeat a metronome, measuring the slow, deliberate dismantling of assumptions, leaving only clarity, accountability, and the calculated consequences that had long been overdue. While I, steady and observant, held the control that had always been mine, but never acknowledged, the moment I held the single key in my hand, its cold metal surface pressing against my palm. I felt the weight of years condensed into one simple object, a symbol of authority long denied, a quiet instrument capable of rewriting assumptions and unmasking every pretense that had passed unnoticed. The room around me was dim, the shadows stretching from corner to corner, merging with the tension that pulsed beneath the surface. Every breath deliberate, every heartbeat synchronized with the inevitability of exposure. I traced the edges of the key with my fingers, as if feeling the authority it represented, the potential it held to open doors that had long concealed greed, entitlement, and the casual disregard I had endured silently. Memories flashed unbidden, the dismissive gestures at family gatherings, the whispered calculations behind polite smiles, the subtle acts of exclusion that had marked decades of invisible labor and unacknowledged contributions. And each one reinforced the precision with which I now approached this moment. Outside, the winter wind rattled against the window, indifferent, yet somehow echoing the quiet inevitability that accompanied this action, the revelation that would follow, and the recalibration of power that was long overdue. I imagined the consequences, the subtle shifts in posture, the quickened breath, the disbelief on faces that had assumed superiority, the sudden awareness that every act of entitlement would be rendered powerless by the legal, undeniable authority I now held symbolically in a single key. No dramatic gestures were necessary. The presence of the key, the calm and deliberate patience that had brought me here, and the quiet anticipation of the unfolding truth were sufficient to command attention. The room, dim and still, seemed to hold its breath along with me, the muted tones and subtle reflections emphasizing the gravity of the moment, while I understood with clarity that the holiday facades, the polite pretenses, and the false securities would crumble systematically, leaving only the stark, measured, and irrevocable consequences I had long prepared for, all contained within the small, cold object now resting firmly in my hand the instant I stepped outside into the frigid morning air. The emptiness of the street seemed to mirror the stark clarity of the reckoning I carried, each step crunching through thin layers of frost, as though the world itself measured the weight of my purpose. The sky was pale, almost indifferent, casting cold light over empty sidewalks and shuttered homes. Yet within that neutrality, I felt the culmination of years of patient observation, quiet endurance, and meticulous preparation settling over me like a precise, invisible mantle. My breath formed small clouds that dissipated instantly, a subtle reminder of impermanence and inevitability, while in my hand, the envelope rested heavier than its physical mass suggested, a silent agent of consequences poised to reshape assumptions and expose truths long concealed. I thought of the countless holiday gatherings, the polite performances, the dismissive glances, and the hushed calculations that had defined decades of family interactions, each one a thread now ready to be unraveled systematically, revealing motives, greed, and entitlement in their rawest form. I walked steadily, boots pressing into the frost, posture measured, every movement deliberate, as if the very act of stepping forward carried the gravity of judgment and authority. The awareness that nothing could now prevent the quiet, inevitable dismantling of facades. Even the faint sounds of distant traffic and muted holiday lights seemed secondary, irrelevant to the storm I carried silently. Because the reckoning was not dependent on spectacle, it required only precision, timing, and the immutable truth held in the documents I had meticulously curated. With each step, the street grew quieter, the light sharper, the inevitability of revelation more pronounced. And I understood that the world outside, indifferent as it was, would bear witness to the collapse of assumptions, while I, steadfast, poised, and observant, would remain the calm executor of consequences long overdue, the measured force behind exposure, and the silent authority ensuring that truth would finally be acknowledged without excuse, embellishment, or delay. The moment I placed the envelope on the polished table, the room seemed to hold its breath. The faint hum of the heater and the distant glow of muted holiday lights outside, forming a stark contrast to the weight of inevitability settling over the space. I watched, calm but resolute, as my son's eyes flickered to the envelope, a subtle shift of posture betraying disbelief before he even touched it. And I understood that every slight, every assumption, every act of entitlement that had been taken for granted over decades was about to collide with the reality I now held deliberately in my hands. The air felt dense, almost viscous, each breath measured, each heartbeat echoing the slow rhythm of exposure, the quiet orchestration of revelation that had been years in the making. I recalled the countless holiday dinners, the polite smiles, the veiled dismissals, the subtle calculations designed to minimize my presence, to ignore my contributions, and to assert control over a family dynamic they assumed was theirs to command. And now all of that pretense was poised on the edge of collapse. My hands rested calmly near the envelope, steady despite the tension radiating from those around me. As I observed the small, involuntary movements, the tightening of fingers, the half step back, the sharp intake of breath, all indicators that the moment of reckoning had arrived, and no pretense could survive the clarity of truth. I imagined the unfolding of realization in real time. The shock, the disbelief, the recalibration of perceived power, and the sudden acknowledgement that their assumptions of control had been fundamentally flawed, that the patience, knowledge, and preparation I had cultivated were instruments of precise justice. Outside, the muted winter light filtered through the windows, indifferent, yet accentuating the stark contrast between holiday cheer and the cold inevitability that had infiltrated the room. I understood that this moment, deliberate, controlled, and unflinchingly truthful, would leave an imprint far heavier than any words or arguments. The final curtain on assumptions, the undeniable exposure of motives long concealed, with me as the calm executor, witness, and orchestrator of consequences that were long overdue and meticulously inevitable. The instant the envelope was finally opened, a heavy silence descended, as if the room itself recognized the magnitude of truth now unleashed. And I felt the culmination of decades of observation, endurance, and patient preparation settle around me like a cloak of quiet authority. My son's eyes widened imperceptibly at the signatures, clauses, and stipulations carefully laid out, each line stripping away assumptions, revealing greed, entitlement, and hidden calculations that had been masked behind polite holiday facades. And I realized in that moment how much power had been silently held in my hands all along. Air seemed to thicken, compressing the space with the gravity of exposure, and every involuntary movement, the tightening of fists, the sudden shift in posture, the flicker of disbelief, became a testimony to the reckoning I had orchestrated with meticulous precision, measured patience, and unwavering resolve. I thought of all the years I had quietly endured dismissals, manipulations, and the subtle erosion of my contributions. And yet the calmness in my posture, the steady rhythm of my breathing, and the deliberate unfolding of each fact conveyed more authority than anger ever could. Round us, the holiday decorations, once symbols of forced cheer and hollow tradition, now seemed almost irrelevant, muted in the face of unflinching truth. While I observed the shift in dynamics, the sudden respect that had been withheld for decades, and the unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power had irrevocably changed, I spoke then softly but firmly, every word deliberate, cutting through tension without a raised voice. This is the reality of what has been ignored for too long. And as the room absorbed the impact, I felt a strange sense of closure, the weight of years finally lightened by the clarity of justice served. And I turned to the camera, addressing you directly. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. Thank you for listening and witnessing this moment with me. In that instant, the storm of holiday pretense and silent manipulation had dissipated, leaving only acknowledgement, truth, and a measured, hard-earned peace that resonated far beyond the walls of the house, a testament to endurance, foresight, and the quiet power of patience finally realized.